Welcome back. So it's a quarter past the hour, and we will move to the second paper of the session. And the second paper is called Regulation-Induced CSR, and the presenter is Jing from UTS. Jing?
Okay. Good afternoon. Thanks for the organizer for giving me the opportunity to present this work here. This Regulation-Induced CSR is a joint work with Vidhi and Chhaochharia from University of Miami and Regulation from USW. And Rick is also in the audience. So in this paper, we ask one central question. Does regulation-induced CSR have any positive impact on the society? And we use a unique setting in India. So in 2013, Indian government passed Companies Act. It requires a firm that satisfies certain size or profit threshold to spend at least 2% of its net profit on CSR. The goal of the government is to inculcate a sense to involvement and responsibilities in the corporate sector for social development by utilizing not just their fund, but also their capabilities and management skills. So that's why the government choose to have a mandatory CSR spending instead of impose increases in taxes. So initially, this legislation comes with a comply or explain feature. That means if a company doesn't spend the 2% prescribed amount, the board of directors can disclose the reason of non-compliance in their annual report. But since then, the government revised the rules to make the rules more stringent. So after 2019, if a company doesn't spend the prescribed amount for over 3 years, they have to deposit the money to a fund nominated by the government. But in our study, we use the period from the law initially come into effective and before the 2019 amendment. So the firms follow complying or explain feature. So besides the mandatory CSR spending, the legislation also required mandatory disclosure of CSR activities in a prescribed format. So this allows us to get a CSR data set that is free from the self-reporting issues. The legislation also have a clear definition of what is eligible CSR expenditures. For example, spendings in the health, education, rural area, etc. And there are some projects are not considered as CSR. For example, if it's political donations, if the project only benefits the employees or their families, or if the project is actually part of the normal business of the company. So in this sense, the CSR in this Indian setting is more similar to the corporate philanthropy. Board of directors is responsible for formulating CSR policies and monitor its implementation. So given 2% of the eligible firms, that include both public and private firms, is a large amount. So naturally, we expect to see any impact of the CSR on the society. But on the other hand, there are some reasons make us to be skeptical about the effect of CSR. So that we break down this question into two small questions. The first is, can this complying or explain regulation induce company to spend? Because they always have an easy way out. They can just disclose the reason for non-compliance in their annual report. And there are two recent papers that also suggest that the companies that used to spend more than 2% of their profits, they might reduce their spending. But in our data sets, we cannot find this pattern. So the second small question is, if the company did spend, and can we observe any effect of their spending on the society? The first reason we may not be able to say the effect is because of the crowd-out effects. In Becker's and List, these papers summarize the studies that document the government spending can crowd out the private spending in the philanthropy expenditures. And here, the private sector spending by the firms can crowd out other activities by the government, non-profit sectors, or individuals. And India also have a weak legal system. The corporate misbehavior and the tunneling is prevalent. So we can imagine their firms might be able to tunnel the CSR money back to the firm itself or to their managers. In fact, some media reports provide anecdotal evidence of the corporate misbehavior in the CSR spending. And the last reason is the money might be spent on projects that do not create much value to the society. For example, this picture shows a monument in Gujarat, and 4 big oil companies spent 1.2 billion rupee to build this monument. And the monument happened to be in the hometown of the prime minister. So it's really hard to say this kind of spending is a CSR expenditure for cultural events or cultural projects, or it is political donation in the guise of CSR spending. And the Dharmapala and Khanna, this paper also found the companies impacted by the CSR rules also reduce their advertising expenditures. So CSR expenditure and advertising expenditure are, have a substituting effect. So all these 4 reasons make us to be skeptical about the effect of CSR. So before I go into the data sets and our methodology, and let me have a quick overview of our results. In 2019, over 60% of the companies spent the full prescribed CSR amount. The total actual CSR amount is similar to the total prescribed CSR amount. So this is because out of this 60% of the companies spend the full prescribed amount, some of them actually spend more than 2%, actually more than 4%. So when we sum the prescribed amount of all the companies is quite similar to the actually CSR amount. Because out of all the sectors I mentioned before, the education sector received the highest CSR amount. So we will focus on the outcomes in the schools. So we found 1 million rupee CSR expenditure leads to 49 more students, 0.1 more school, and 2 more teachers. It also leads to improvement in school facilities, such as access to drinking water, and number of toilets in the school, number of computers and books in the libraries. We also found the effect is driven by private schools instead of public schools. Our main data source is from Prime. So Prime provides the project level CSR data. So this is an example of how the company discloses the information. If we look at project 18, we first have the project descriptions, what this project is about. And then we have the sector information. This is for the education sector. And we also have the location, geographic location of the CSR expenditure. And we also have the actual amount spent in this year. So besides the CSR data, we also get the financial data from PAVIS, which is commonly used for studying Indian companies. And our main outcome variables is from District Information System for Education, the DICE data. It is the annual census of primary, upper primary, and high school in India. This survey is conducted by a university. So we can reasonably expect the results of the DICE data is free from the influence of any companies. And they collect the school level data, and we know the number of students in the school, the number of teachers in the school, and what sort of facilities the school has. Because the DICE only started to collect the high school data during our sample period, so we only focus on the primary and upper primary school outcomes. So accordingly, we also restrict the projects to be the educational projects and also exclude any project that is clearly not for primary or upper primary. For example, if you have the keywords university or occupational skills in the project description will exclude these projects. And we also have the Nightlight data, which is kindly shared with us by Bayer et al. And at the end, we aggregate the project level data, the firm level data, and the school level data into a district year level panel data. So our first question is whether the legislation can induce company to spend. Here, I plot the CSR proxy over the profit from 2010 fiscal year to 2018 fiscal year. And here I call it CSR proxy because the definition of CSR here doesn't exactly match the CSR definition of the Companies Act. So this is a sum of donations, social and community expenditure, and environment-related expenditure in the financial report. But the advantage of using this data is we can get the pre-legislation period CSR. So if we look at here, in the pre-period, that is from 2010 to 2014, roughly about 60% of the firm spent zero amount of the CSR. But from the first year, 2015, about 20% of the firm spent zero amount. And we also see a bunching effect around 2%. That is a target spending ratio. And this pattern, we can observe this pattern in all the post period. And we can also see gradually more and more firms spend in the CSR. And next, I will do the same, exactly same kind of plotting, but now I'm using the CSR information from the prime data, which is follow the same definition of the Companies Act. The downside is I only got the data from 2015 onwards. And similarly, we found a bunching effect around 2%, the target ratio. And we also see a considerable amount of firms spend more than 4% of their profit in CSR. And this number is truncated at 4%. So it seems a large amount of firms actually choose to spend instead of to explain. So another way to look at how firm comply with rule is looking at whether they manipulate around the threshold. But unfortunately, there are only a small number of firms around this profit and size cutoff threshold. So we cannot find a very clear evidence of manipulation. And in this table, I report the geographic locations of the CSR funding. And here we have two CSR measures. The first is the total CSR amount spent by all the firms in one district. And the second CSR is the CSR total scaled by the size of the district. So overall, we found the CSR expenditure flows into the districts that have higher nightlights, higher literacy rates, more urban population, and have more road access. So overall, it indicates the CSR flows to more developed area. Okay, this is our baseline results. We're looking at the effect of the CSR on school outcomes. We have three school outcomes here: the number of students enrollment, a number of schools in a district, and number of teachers. So in the first three columns, we have the changes in the enrollment, schools, and teachers. And from column 4 to 6, we have the log transformation of these three variables. And our main independent variables are CSR scaled by the size, that is the number of schools in the district in the first year in our sample period, and then lagged CSR. We also have a state year and the nightlight fixed effects. So a big concern for us is we know, like from the last table, we know the money flows disproportionately to the more developed area. So what if the more developed districts also have a higher growth rate and their schools have a higher improvement than other schools even without the CSR spending? So we're trying to use the state time trend, state times year times the nightlife quintile to control this time economic trend. We found 1 million Ruby CSR spending is associated with 49 more students, 0.1 more school, and 2 more teachers. So it will be really interesting. So initially when we start the project, we are interested to compare the efficiency of private spending versus public spending. But unfortunately here we cannot find a very good public spending education. So we cannot compare the marginal effect of 1 million spent by the government, how much effect they will have. The only number we can get is the average. So on average, the government spent about 1 million for 49 students. But here we document marginal effects. And in the second table, we split the schools into the government and private schools. So one of our main concerns here is omitted variable bias. So what if the company choose to spend in the district and received higher government funding? So we expect to see more improvement in school outcomes because of they receive the government funding, and we don't have the government funding data. So here we split them into the schools into government and the private. And in the private schools, there are 2 types of private schools in India: unaided private schools and aided private schools. The aided private schools is actually more like a government schools. So their salary of the teachers is funded by the government, and the recruiting process is managed by the government agents. And unaided private school is truly like private schools independent from the government. So if the government spending is omitted variable that bias our results, we expect to see the effect comes from government schools, which is funded by the government, or the private aided private schools. But we found our result is driven by unaided private schools. So that alleviated the concern that the government spending is the omitted variable driving our results. And in this table, we regress the night lights, the changes in the night lights on the CSR. So this is another the endogeneity concern. So what if we know the money goes to more developed area? What if this area happen to have a higher growth rate as well? And then we might see more improvement in education outcomes even without the CSR spending. But we found the CSR spending is negatively associated with, at least there's no evidence of positive correlation between the growth in nightlights and the CSR. So that is work against our the concern we have. So we also tried to use the different measure of the development. We tried, that's not in the version, the paper I sent, but we also tried to use the bank deposit in a district, and the result is similar. It's negative and statistically significant. Okay, so this table will address another concern. So what if we observe more students are in the school, but what if this is at the cost of the education quality? Right, so here we're looking at whether the CSR spending is associated with more students who failed a grade, the changes in number of repeaters. We also split the repeaters into boys and girls, but overall we found no evidence that CSR spending is associated with more students who failed a grade. Okay, in this last table, we're looking at other school outcomes. So here we have the enrollment split by boys and girls, and we have the number of toilets, female toilets or number of boy toilets, and number of schools with boundary walls, and number of schools that have the water access to the drinking water, and the total number of computers in a district, and total number of books in a district. So overall, we found the CSR spending is associated with positive outcomes, with more boy enrollment, girl enrollment, and more toilets and computers. If you look at the economic magnitude, this is 1 million CSR, 1 million rupee CSR expenditure is associated with, say, 3 computers, right? The magnitude seems to be low, but let's bear in mind this effect we document here is on top of the effect on enrollment, on number of schools, on the teachers. This is because we can only observe this district received CSR in education, but we don't know whether the money is spent on computer or spent on buying books or building schools. Okay, let me conclude. Since 2014 to 2015 fiscal year, the Indian government required companies to meet the size and profit threshold to spend at least 2% of their net profit in CSR activities. And the rule adopt a complying or explain framework. We asked 2 questions in this unique setting. The first is, can the regulator induce companies to spend in CSR using this soft approach? And the second is, can CSR activities lead to a positive impact on the society? So we found the percentage of fully compliant firms increases over time from 37% in 2015 to over 60% in 2019. And we also document a significantly positive impact on the primary and upper primary schools. But there is also a caveat. We found the CSR spending disproportionately flows to more developed area. So it seems these kind of rules won't be very successful if the goal is to reduce the disparity among the regions. And that's all. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jing. And the discussion is Arkodipta Sarkar from HKUST.
Okay, so thank you for having me discuss the paper. So it was really interesting to read your paper, and Jing already did a very good work in summarizing the paper and laying down the main findings, but I'll just go over briefly to what the main takeaways or my takeaways from the paper was. So the main findings from the paper is that CSR spending increased in India after a regulation required firms to spend at least 2% of their profits on CSR activities. So this was one of their preliminary findings, or one of the first finding that the paper had. But the main focus of the paper was to understand what impact it had on the real economy, or the real impact that it had. So the real impact of CSR expenditure of firms on the education sector was what the paper looked at. They found that the higher CSR expenditure by firms led to higher enrollment in the schools, more teachers, and more number of school itself being built. And the effect was primarily on the private schools, not the government aided schools. So in India, there is different types of schools. One is school that is completely funded by the government, while the others are partially funded by the government or completely privately owned. The effect was primarily on the private school, not on the schools that were funded by the government. So the empirical strategy that the paper relied on for identifying the real impact was comparison across district within the same state with varying CSR expenditure that these districts received. So the paper used state cross year cross nighttime light fixed effect, which means that the identification came from across districts within the same state, and the variation was coming from the amount of CSR expenditure that each district received. And that was the empirical strategy used, and they used this to see what this additional dollar of CSR expenditure had on each of these parameters in terms of school enrollment, teachers, and so on. And the main takeaway that the paper has is that regulation-induced corporate philanthropy can have positive real economic consequences. So this is the main takeaway that the paper wants us to have. Now, let me lay down my comments that I have about the paper. So my first comment is to how to think about the question that the paper is laying down. So what is exactly the null hypothesis that the paper is proposing us? So the first is in the empirical analysis of the paper, the authors use the location of CSR spending as exogenous. Now, when we are seeing the effect that is coming on the real economic activity, we see the effect that happens when the CSR spending is different across different districts, right? So the CSR spending is exogenous. So when we are going ahead and answering the question on the real economic effect, what exactly is the null hypothesis? Is the null hypothesis that an additional dollar of CSR activity that goes on in a district will have no real impact? In the context of India, which is much resource constrained place, this is quite hard to believe that any additional dollar, like in India being primarily a constrained area where schools lack funds, resources, everything, an additional dollar will have absolutely zero effect. I understand the premise of the question that firms might not end up doing CSR because there is a lot of evidence of corruption, tunneling, and so on and so forth. But the premise of the paper is that when there is expenditure happening in different districts, whether that is going ahead and having an impact on real economic consequences. So the null over there is the additional dollar is unlikely to have any real impact, which in the context of a resource constrained economy seems unlikely. So then the point comes to the fact whether the paper is about identifying the exact magnitude or not. And there I think that the author should then highlight that we want to particularly identify the magnitude of the effect. For me, the more interesting part of the question would be, how do companies end up choosing which sector to invest or which school to invest? So it would be more interesting for me to see what exactly is the location where the expenditures are ending up, which is the place that the firms are ending up doing the expenditures. Now, there is another hypothesis laid down in the paper, which is about private and public disbursement of public good, right? So there is this literature which talks about which is the more efficient way of disbursing public goods, whether private involvement is more efficient or public involvement is more efficient. So this paper, in a way, tries to answer that question as well, that whether private and public, how that has a comparative advantage in providing public goods. And in this particular question, I find is more novel and interesting because we don't know how to answer this question in the context of literature, which particular type of provision would be more effective. Now, the result that we see that the findings are coming from the private schools and not from the government schools makes the point that there is a more efficient private provision of public goods. So that is one takeaway that one can have from this paper, that private firms, when they are providing more money to the schools, that can have a higher impact than government spending. However, there should be some caveats when we are taking away these results from the paper, because the objective function of public and private could differ in many ways. So the public firms or government might be willing to provide education to the entire district, while private companies might want to provide good education to a set of, say only 10% to the particular place. So one should be more thoughtful about how to interpret this results, because public and private could have different objective function, leading to a different selections across public and private schools. So, but having said that, I believe that this part of the paper about private and public disbursement of the goods was more appealing to me while I was reading the paper. So this was my first comment. My next comment was more to do with the identification strategy of the paper. So the identification strategy relies on cross-sectional comparison across districts, right? So, however, so the underlying assumption is that the spending is randomly distributed across districts within the same state. However, we know that there exists many heterogeneities across districts within the states, right? There are different infrastructures like road, different bureaucratic efficiencies across different districts, because large amount of this spending has to be routed through the local bureaucrats in the area, right? And these efficiencies can vary a lot across different districts, and that can lead to some form of heterogeneity in terms of unobservables according to this paper across districts, which might have different effect of selecting which districts to go ahead and invest. So the authors does control for some of the fact by looking at nighttime light and clubbing, looking at districts within the same nighttime light quintiles, but much of this difference might not end up being reflected in growth numbers itself, and one doesn't know whether which particular parameters would have different growth implications. So there should be more things done to say that the districts which receives different amount of CSR activities are comparable in nature. So that I believe the author should work more to provide more evidence to say that districts which varies the amount of CSR that it is receiving are comparable. And I believe a stronger assumption is also being taken in the paper when comparing the CSR expenditures across different years, right? So over here, the comparison is within the same year across different districts, but we also see the comparison across different years. So the stronger assumption that is being required over here is that every year the CSR expenditure is randomized across the different districts. However, that might not be the case, right? A firm can invest in the same school over years, and the authors in that table want to explain whether the effect is particularly coming from contemporary CSR activities or the lagged CSR activities. Now, given the fact that if a firm ends up investing in a school in one district, they'll keep on investing in that school again and again. So CSR could be predicted by the lagged CSR in itself. So this entire regression suffers from the problem of bad controls, what one would call in the literature. But more importantly, it would be better if the cross-sectional difference is what matters. It would be better for the authors to just remove the time dimension and do a cross-sectional comparison in their identification strategy. One thing that I felt is, could the analysis be done at the school level in itself? So the PRIME database provides information on the location of the CSR activities, and I'm just wondering whether the location has the exact geocodes of the school, so that this expenditure then can be mapped with the school outcomes of that particular school in itself, and then one could look at the outcome across two different schools within the same district, controlling for many other factors, right? Then you can uniquely identify whether a school is receiving more funds and what is happening to the outcome. So you can look at within district across school comparison, as well as within school across time with the amount of CSR expenditures that they are ending up receiving, right? So this is one way that the authors could work more in terms of identifying the causal interpretation of the CSR activities. So these were my two primary points. So I'll just lay down some other comments that I had. Is to me, what exactly was the use of regulatory reform for the purpose of this exercise, right? So this exercise is done from the period when the regulation had already been implemented. So are we thinking of this regulation as just the instrument which is causing more amount of money to flow into this particular area? Because the time series variation in the regulation is not utilized in the empirical setup of studying the real economic consequences, right? Because the entire data that looks at the real economic consequences are after the regulation had already been passed. So we cannot look at any of the real economic outcomes for the pre-regulatory periods. So I'm just wondering which part of the identification or the question would be impacted by the voluntary contribution. So if one would have just looked at voluntary I understand that there are more expenditure that are coming because of this regulation-based CSR, but even the voluntary contribution could also be used to answer this question, right? Because we are not particularly using regulation as a shock to identify the effect of real economic outcomes. The next is it possible to, because you have time dimension, you could have also exploited the time series variation in the CSR that is coming in a particular region, right? You have in your empirical specification state cross year fixed effects, which is which is allowing the identification from the cross-sectional variation. But a district fixed effect would also allow you to have the identification come from the time series variations, which I see is missing over here. And then there are some other points, like minor points, like because the shocks are coming at the district level, you could have ended up clustering your errors and district level, but these are really minor points. I'll just conclude by saying that this to me is an important paper which primarily answers the question of CSR activity, but also allows us to shed light on public versus private provisions of public good and the efficiency that these different provisions might have. And I feel that this possibly could be the main focus of the paper. I feel that some more work could be done to infer the causal interpretation that the paper is trying to provide. And I'm looking forward to read the next draft of your paper. Thank you again for having me discuss the paper, Casper, and thanks, Jing, for doing a great presentation and sharing the paper with me.
Thanks, Arko. And Jing, 1 minute reply.
Okay. Hi, Arko. Thanks for your wonderful comments. I agree with you. Identification is a key here. So I presented this paper in December last year in the same workshop. So since then, we've been working on identification. But so we are thinking of to get IV, but still working on it. But I kind of disagree with you about the non-hypothesis. So I think it's not that clear the money spent in a district will have the real impact, mainly because of the crowd out effect. In fact, I was not aware that Rajagopal and Tantri's, I'm aware of this Rajagopal and Tantri's paper suggested by Hao Liang, and they said the 2%, some firms spend more than 2% actually in pre-period, they reduce the spending. But I cannot find the effect in my data so far. So I will read the paper again to see how they found that results. And also we are concerned about the crowd out from the government or other charity spending in the district. So it's not very clear. If companies start to spend, then we observe the effects. So unfortunately, we cannot observe. The big problem is that we cannot observe the government spending, whether government will spend less because the companies start to spend, or from the other donations through the charities. Yeah.
Sure. Good. Let's go to questions. So I'm going to abuse my position and ask the first question. Jing, so I think it's helpful to think about internal versus external sort of effects. So you have sort of a setting where you show that there are more students that are being enrolled and there are more schools being built. And I think it's kind of, when you then look at your additional results, it seems to sort of potentially pick up that effect. Because I would be surprised if you're building new schools without toilets or without a library, without computers. So I think it's helpful to sort of look at sort of, your results through that lens. So what's the effect within existing schools and what's the effect, on, new schools? Because part of the results might just reflect the sort of that there's new schools being built in the districts, and that leads to more toilets, more students enrolled. So to some extent, these regressions should sort of take that into account.
Okay, I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
Okay, so then we'll go to Hao Liang. You had a question that was partially addressed, I think.
Indeed, Jing already partially addressed it. I just want to mention that although I hate when people ask me what's the social welfare implication, but I think you are directly speaking about social welfare implication, which becomes quite messy. So I think my comments, rather than a question, is just about what should be the right counterfactual, especially when we take into account of the crowded out CSR activity, which may even lead to more social welfare improvement. But I don't have an answer either. I know it's too big a question, but just want to draw your attention on this paper.
Thank you.
Johan, you had a question in the chat box.
So I think all these questions are related to sort of crowding out effects, right? And also there's a question of distributional assumption here regarding who is in the private school and who are in the government or aided schools. If to some extent, if resources are being poured into the private schools, this could benefit some students in the private schools, but it could hurt students in the government schools if teachers who were previously teaching in government schools now move to private schools, right? So if you start thinking about sort of the labor market for teachers and how this can tilt the playing field against government schools and aided schools, and if those are the ones that have poorer students, so you may actually create a more unbalanced playing field. And I just don't know the structure of the education system in India, so I cannot really speak much about this distributional effect. But I think this is something that I think you should consider as well, because when you document effects, the educational effects, the educational results, you have all the fixed effects in place, right? Which means that what you are seeing is sort of the marginal improvement of the private schools, but you don't see whether it's coming from the increase in the performance of the private schools or is it the decrease of the performance of the benchmarks. So you may have, it's not clear to me at least, because of the structure of your regression. So I think this needs to be addressed. I don't know if you can look at salaries of teachers or sort of other types of resources being poured into the education system. But the distributional assumption, the distributional effect, I think needs to be taken care of before you can say something about welfare, because welfare is about the average, but it's also about the distribution, right?
Yes, I think we actually found some substituting effect there, because when we split the private and public, the positive effect come from the increase in private schools, but the sign in the public and the non-public aided school are negative. So it seems there might be some students actually shifting from the public schools to the private schools. But we also look at the total, all the students in a district. So that can capture the negative externality. And I don't have the teacher salary data, but I have a measure of teacher quality, and I can check whether the effect that the better teacher will move to private school. And I think that's a nice suggestion. Thank you.
You're also looking at repeaters, right? So repeaters, the effect on repeaters, you can consider whether it's coming from the fact that private schools are doing better, or is it because the public schools are doing worse after the shock?
Yeah.
Ulpal? So
Ulpal needs to raise his hand before he can speak. So maybe he can raise his hand.
Let me just read Ulpal's question. So it's sort of asking whether does CSR flow more to private schools than public schools because these firms prefer one over the other, or is it because private schools are more receptive to aid?
I don't know the answer to this question.
Okay.
I don't even know whether the money actually flow more to the private school or public school. Yeah, I just can measure the money flow to the district.
So is there a time trend in private schools in India?
There are more enrollment in the private schools, and the enrollment in overall in our sample period is actually decreasing.
Okay, because sort of the design you have with the district year panel, we know that that's, a different diff setting here is very prone to pick up time trends in the data. So when you think about your identification, you might want to sort of apply this Bertrand, Dulfo, Muranathan test where you sort of, you compare your estimates to sort of randomly allocated treatment effects across districts, across times, to sort of just to at least convince the reader that you're not picking up a shift, in enrollment from public to private schools.
Yeah.
Other questions from the floor? We have plenty of time.
Can I ask one thing, like just so the only way that a dollar unit will not be effective is through the crowding out, or is there other way that you believe that there could be corruption, or it might end up into some bureaucrat's pocket that you wouldn't expect any impact to happen, or is it just crowding out? Because I'm just wondering that having, like, in a place like India, whether any private investment can crowd out the entire government investment in the public sector schools.
Okay, let me also jump in a little bit. So remember, the measured spending is the claimed spending, not the actual spending. So the fact that claimed spending is having an impact, firstly suggests that a significant fraction of what is claimed to be spent is actually spent. Because you can always sort of say, I am spending, but you're actually doing something else with it. So one of the key takeaways is, in fact, that not only is the government regulation getting firms to at least claim that they are spending, but a lot of that claimed spending actually seems to be real spending, because there is no way you can actually get real impact unless there was real spending. Now, so you have to kind of think about the impact we are measuring is of the claimed spending on outcomes. And that is where, in that context, the null hypothesis might have been that claimed spending may not have had much impact because the real spending wasn't that big.
Right. So it's more like the government, like the companies are artificially manipulating their book, or some sort of like corruption, particular accounting manipulation.
So now there are three different ways in which this may not show up. So firstly, when this started happening, there were lots of stories that supposedly in the newspapers, intermediaries started popping up, which will say that we will do quote unquote CSR for you. And then some people were saying, oh, this is happening a lot. Companies would give money to them, and then they would sort of return the money to the company in some other way through some contract that they have with the company on a side business, right? So one might imagine that in a setting where the companies were not spending money voluntarily, when the government forces them to do so, even if they are saying that they are spending money, they might find, especially in a setting like India, ways of actually not spending that money for what they're claiming to spend. And this is especially true in India, where we know that there is, this is a common sort of, you get kickbacks and so on and so forth, and there's all sort of setup, which is easy to do. There is a standard setup in various business transactions where you can sort of get the kickback. Now, in some sense, that is perhaps the main takeaway of the paper, that the fact that you do see real impact is that, at least in aggregate, not much of that is happening. Of course, there are some cases where it might be happening, but if in aggregate, most of the claim spending was not actually being spent, you couldn't have seen real impact. And so one of the things is that. The second thing is basically, where you spend, meaning you say, okay, I'm really building a school, but you don't really care about the school so much. So you might spend a huge amount of money and build one very fancy school somewhere and put your company's board on top. In that case, you wouldn't get that much gain in terms of the sort of aggregate district level outcomes if most of the spending is happening that way. So even if the claimed spending is real, you might not focus on what the kind of outcomes you might care about. You might just focus on things being more fancy, using that as more of an advertising avenue rather than trying to increase the number of students or hiring more teachers and so on and so forth. So that's the second reason. Even if the money is spent, it is not necessary that one should expect that you would have all of this impact in aggregate.
So suggestion along that line. So the data contains information about whether the CSR program is managed by the company or foundation related to the company, or whether
Yes.
it's managed by a third party.
It does, and in overwhelmingly large majority of the cases, the company, at least in the initial few years, sets up its own foundation and directs the money through that. And there is a subset where there is a pre-existing third party that is doing that. But most of these cases, company actually sets up their own foundation or does the spending themselves essentially. So it's direct basically. And we actually do see that. I think Junku has a question.
Junku?
Okay. So I'm just curious about this the Indian school. So for public and private school, so how is this government funding is allocated? Many economy, for example, in emerging economy, even maybe private school may receive substantial amount of money from the government. And I'm not sure how about in this.
So we actually do know that. So even within the private, so in fact, so one thing you should know, in India, private schools, actually the poorer students go there on average. I mean, generally in most countries, you would think private schools is where you wouldn't, because most of India is sort of, so the average private school is actually worse off than the average government school. First of all, that should be kept in mind. Because the government school has minimum standards that has to be met, and at the marginal school is not able to meet that minimum standards. And the marginal school is actually, quote unquote, a private school. Okay. Now, within the private schools, there are some schools that are the aided private schools, which actually get money from the government and therefore have to meet the government minimum standards. Okay. So what we do find is, in fact, those aided private schools are also not where we are seeing the impact. The unaided private schools are, in fact, those private schools which are on average sort of the worst. On average, they don't meet the minimum standards and so on and so forth. Okay. The typical unaided private school, on average, what it tries to do is get to the minimum standards so that it can become an aided private school, so that it can get the money from the government. Okay? That is the thing that they would usually try to do. The reason they are not getting the money from the government is because they sort of don't meet the standards. Now, when a new school is formed, it will by default be an unaided private school, until the time it can sort of show using its track record that we meet the standards so that we should qualify for the government aid and consequently become the aided private school. Okay. So in some sense, the way you should think about it is, for the average district in India, these private schools, the unaided private schools, are actually the worst off. The government schools for the average district in India is where the best sort of students would try to get into. And if they are not able to get into, then they'll sort of have to go to the other ones.
Okay. So the reason I'm asking the question is because you are focusing on so-called this regulation-induced CSR, right? So
Right.
the company who make a lot of money, they spend more CSR because by definition, right? So the high profit means also they have to pay a lot of tax. So if there are a lot of company who has to pay a lot of tax in certain district, you see that there's tax money coming in. So government have more ability to spend those money to support the private
Right.
sector. So I think that is kind of the question which I wanted to ask.
I see. That's a good point. So none of the corporate taxes at the district level, as far as I can tell, even at the state level, it's all the indirect taxes, meaning the sales tax, revenues taxes, which the state government gets. So, but there is no sort of district level direct receipt of taxes, and all our sort of comparisons are within state. Okay, and most all the regular taxes that you would think taxes on profits, that actually is at the federal level.
Good. Any other one that had the virtual hand up that I didn't know? So I have a data question, and so Jing, related to the slide you showed with the raw data.
Mm-hmm.
So the firms are like listing these various CSR programs that they are contributing to, and then it has a breakdown of the activity, which might be education, and then it has a location.
Yeah.
Now on the samples you showed us, like there was, I didn't see which firm it was, but it had education, but then it had multiple districts. So how do you allocate the budget spent on education to the district when you have multiple districts that might have received money?
I use population weighted. So if a larger district, I assume they will get more money.
Okay. All right. Other questions from the floor? Okay, so then we'll just finish a few minutes early. Jing, is there any final comments of things you want to say?
No.
Give you an opportunity. No?
Oh, Ron
Okay.
has a question.
I think there's a question.
Ron has a question. Sorry if it doesn't show up so well on with these hands. Ron, please. Okay, great. So Ron's question is, do you know if the district receiving funds are closely tied to when the firm has where the firm has its major operations?
We actually know it because part of the law also encourages the company to spend in the area where they operate. So we randomly checked some company spending and found the largest spending from within the district, actually from the firms either have a headquarters or have some factory in the district. And also from the company, from the disclosure, even the one example I showed you, they actually said we're spending in the operating area.
Okay, so Ron, I'm assuming that this was answering your question. Good. Wonderful. Last minute question, anyone? Then if not, then we're going to finish here. And thanks a lot for a great discussion, great presentation, Jing. We'll have another coffee break. We're going to resume in 15 minutes. So basically 30 minutes past the hour.